Baghdad, Iraq, October 2004. The city was producing approximately 40 insurgent attacks per day. That number comes from the declassified operational logs of Multinational Force Iraq, the coalition command that General George Casey had assumed in June of that year. And it is the kind of number that loses its meaning the moment you try to hold it in your head as a statistic rather than as 40 separate events. 40 separate detonations and shots and mortar rounds and ambushes that were each, to the people inside them, not a data point but an experience. 40 attacks per day. It worked out, roughly, to one every 36 minutes across the full 24 hours, which meant that at any given moment in Baghdad in October 2004, the next attack was statistically somewhere between imminent and recent. Some were small. A shot fired at a checkpoint from a vehicle that didn't stop, a roadside device that failed to function, a mortar round that traced its arc and landed in a vacant lot on the edge of the Karada district, and left a crater that the neighborhood's children would play in until someone filled it in. Some were not small. The October casualty figures for coalition forces in Iraq were, by the time they were officially compiled, the highest since the previous April's uprisings in Sadr City and Fallujah, when the war had lurched into a phase that the official narratives had not anticipated, and that the men on the ground had anticipated with the clarity of people who were living in the city rather than describing it from a distance. The city was, in the particular language that military organizations develop for situations they cannot fully describe in ordinary terms, kinetic. The word did what military language is designed to do: provide a professional frame for experiences that resist framing. A way of describing a city that was simultaneously the capital of a sovereign state in reconstruction and an active battle space, without having to choose between those two descriptions or acknowledge directly that they were impossible to reconcile. Into the city, two of the most capable special operations units in the world had been inserted with the mission of reducing that number through a targeting process that the official briefings described as precise, and that the men conducting it understood as something more accurately described as a race between the intelligence they could develop and the adaptations that the networks they were targeting were continuously making in response to the pressure being placed on them. The race was not being won in October 2004. It was not being lost either. It was proceeding with the grinding, costly, occasionally brilliant and frequently frustrating momentum of a complex problem being worked by people who were very good at their jobs against an adversary that was also very good at its job. In a city of 6 million people where the adversary lived and the coalition did not. The British unit was B Squadron, 22nd Special Air Service Regiment, operating under the designation Task Force Black. The SAS had been in Iraq since the earliest weeks of the March 2003 invasion, initially in the Western Desert alongside American Special Operations Forces hunting Scud missile sites. Then, as the occupation settled into its grinding second phase, in Baghdad and surrounding provinces, running intelligence-driven operations against the insurgent command networks that the regiment had developed the institutional capacity to run through decades of counterinsurgency in Northern Ireland, Oman, the Falklands, Bosnia, Sierra Leone, and Afghanistan. The regiment's presence in Iraq was not publicly acknowledged by the British government in 2004. It was acknowledged by everyone who needed to know about it. By October of that year, Task Force Black had been watching the compound in the Adhamiyah district for 21 consecutive days, building the kind of patient, granular intelligence picture about who moved through it, when, and with whom that the regiment's operational philosophy required before action was taken. They were not ready to act yet. They were getting there. The American unit was a SEAL Team 6 element, the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, DEVGRU. Established in 1980 by Commander Richard Marcinko in the aftermath of the failed Desert One hostage rescue mission in Iran. When the United States military confronted the humiliation of having the world's finest military and lacking a unit capable of executing a hostage rescue under the conditions that modern terrorism produced, by 2004, DEVGRU had evolved through cycles of expansion and reform into something its founder would have recognized in principle and been staggered by in practice. In Baghdad, it was operating under the JSOC command architecture that General Stanley McChrystal had been building since his appointment as JSOC commander in October 2003, the intelligence to action machine that required the elimination of every unnecessary step between the identification of a target and the execution of action against that target. The machine was still being assembled in October 2004. The specific fusion architecture, the targeting cycles compressed from weeks to hours, the interagency connections that allowed CIA and NSA and DIA intelligence to flow into operational decisions without institutional delays. All of it real, all of it working. None of it yet at the tempo it would reach by 2006 and 2007, when the JSOC operation in Iraq would be running more than a dozen operations per night across the country. The friction that existed in October 2004 was about to become visible in a way that neither unit had planned for. Chief Petty Officer Daniel Reyes had been in Baghdad for 53 days when the night this story is about began assembling itself from its constituent parts in the targeting cell on the eastern edge of the coalition compound that DEVGRU used as its Baghdad operating base. He was 36 years old, at the upper edge of the operational age range for a SEAL Team 6 assault operator. 14 years in the Navy, passed basic underwater demolition SEAL training on his first attempt, which approximately 80% of candidates do not manage. Then moved through the NSW pipeline into DEVGRU, where the selection process tested not whether you could endure. The people being tested had already demonstrated that, but whether you could function at the level DEVGRU required, which was a level that endurance who could not also think clearly at speed did not reach. He had passed that too. He had deployed to Afghanistan 4 times, to the Philippines as part of the Joint Special Operations Task Force running operations against Abu Sayyaf, to the Horn of Africa, where DEVGRU elements were conducting maritime interdiction against financial networks that funded East African terrorism, and to Iraq twice before this rotation. His operational record was extensive, classified, and had produced no incidents requiring institutional review. He had made difficult decisions correctly under conditions designed to make difficult decisions incorrectly. He was reviewing the intelligence package on the compound in the Adhamiyah district when the liaison officer appeared at the targeting cell door with the expression that Reyes had learned, across 3 deployments, to associate with news that was going to cost someone something before the evening was over. Not emergency. Emergencies produced a different facial geography, one of compression and forward lean that communicated the need for immediate response. This was something slower, the expression of a man who had processed something and was now deciding how to present it. The compound was in the Abu Hanifa neighborhood of Adhamiyah, the Sunni district on the eastern bank of the Tigris River that had been, under the old regime, one of Baghdad's most comfortable and prestigious residential areas. Professionals, former regime officials, the kind of middle class that had done well under Saddam Hussein's patronage networks and had watched the new order's arrival with something considerably less than enthusiasm. The Abu Hanifa Mosque, which gave the neighborhood its identity, was one of the most significant Sunni religious sites in Iraq, built in the 11th century on the site of the grave of Abu Hanifa al-Nu'man, founder of the Hanafi school of Islamic jurisprudence, and the location of Saddam Hussein's last public appearance as president. On April 9, 2003, the same day the statue in Firdos Square was pulled down in the moment American media chose as the symbolic end of the regime, Saddam appeared at Abu Hanifa Mosque, shaking hands with supporters, projecting an image of continued authority that collapsed within hours as American forces reached the area. The neighborhood's former regime officials, the intelligence officers, the Republican Guard veterans, the Ba'ath Party administrators who had spent careers in proximity to power and watched those mechanisms dismantled overnight, had not gone away. They had gone underground. By October 2004, Adhamiyah's Sunni identity had made it one of the primary bases of the Ba'athist insurgency's Baghdad operation. The intelligence package concerned a figure the targeting system designated Falcon, a senior logistics coordinator, a pre-war Iraqi intelligence official whose specific function within the Ba'athist insurgent network was the movement of financing and personnel between the external facilitation networks running through Syria and Jordan and the operational cells inside Baghdad. He was not the most senior figure on the JSOC targeting list, not Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, whose network was a parallel and increasingly dominant force in Baghdad's violence, and whose own targeting had consumed enormous coalition resources. Falcon was something more operationally important than a visible figure. He was a node, a connector, a man whose professional value derived not from personal authority, but from his position at the intersection of external resources and internal operations, through which money and people moved in ways that sustained the network's capacity to conduct attacks. His methods for moving both undetected were, according to the intelligence assessment, sophisticated enough that understanding them was itself operationally significant, independent of his removal. The intelligence that identified Falcon, established his function, and located him with sufficient confidence for action had taken 6 weeks. It came from 3 independent streams: signals intelligence characterizing communication patterns consistent with pre-operational coordination, human reporting from 2 separate sources whose access to the relevant network had been independently assessed, and 14 days of overhead surveillance on the compound establishing patterns of activity consistent with the intelligence picture's description of the compound's function. The convergence of 3 independent streams was the targeting process's response to the specific failure mode of single-source intelligence, the fabricated reporting that had produced multiple failed operations in the preceding year. And it was not a guarantee of accuracy, but the closest available approximation to confidence in an environment where confidence was always partial and perishable. The intelligence window on Falcon's presence at the compound had been assessed at 48 to 72 hours. This was the standard perishability estimate for a mobile figure who maintained no fixed location and whose pattern of life involved moving every 3 to 4 days between locations that the intelligence picture had not fully mapped. Falcon had been close to the reach of the targeting process twice before. Both times, the window had closed before the operation could be launched. The assessment that a 3rd missed window would not be followed by a 4th was not certain. But it was the assessment that experienced analysts who were not being optimistic had arrived at, and it was the assessment that Hartley had planned on. Reyes had briefed the mission package to the element commander, a commander named Hartley, 72 hours before this night. Hartley was 40 years old, a Naval Academy graduate who had spent his career in special operations, commanded at troop level in Afghanistan. and developed over 15 years the particular command temperament that separated officers who were good in planning from officers who were reliable in the cognitive conditions of operational command. High stakes, incomplete information, time pressure, decisions that could not be unmade. He had reviewed the Falcon package with the focused attention of a man assessing not just the intelligence but the integrity of the process that produced it, asking the questions that challenged them, assessments rather than the ones that confirmed them. He had been satisfied. He had approved execution for the evening of the 14th. He had directed that the deconfliction notification go to the British liaison process, standard procedure. Also, as it would turn out, insufficient for what was developing, the notification had gone out on the morning of the 13th. It described the target compound, the planned execution window, the general approach geometry, the composition of the assault element. It did not describe the British observation position on the compound's approaches because the DEVGRU element did not know it existed. This was not a failure of communication. It was a failure of architecture. The deconfliction process was designed to share planned operations, not existing surveillance. And the British had not disclosed the observation position because the process did not require it, and because the institutional reflex of the SAS, built across decades of counterinsurgency operation, where disclosed positions became compromised positions, was to protect surveillance locations from any external disclosure until operational necessity required otherwise. What the coming hours would demonstrate was that the definition of operational necessity had not been calibrated for a situation in which two task forces were operating simultaneously against the same objective without either having a complete picture of what the other was doing. The response to the notification arrived at 21:47 hours, 3 hours before the planned launch window. It came through the Royal Navy lieutenant named Calloway, the British liaison officer who had been embedded with the DEVGRU element for 6 weeks and who had, in those 6 weeks, built the working relationship with Reyes and Hartley that made the next 30 minutes navigable. He had been at his workstation in the targeting cell when the response came through the British channel. He had read it. He had read it a second time, not because the first reading was unclear, but because the implications required the second reading to fully assemble themselves. Then he had closed his laptop, stood, walked to where Reyes was working, and arrived with the expression that Reyes would later describe in his after-action contribution as the expression of a professional who has been handed a problem he did not create and cannot solve alone and knows it. "There's a complication," Calloway said. Reyes had spent 6 weeks learning to decode the register of British military understatement with sufficient accuracy that the word complication, delivered with that particular weight and preceded by that particular pause, communicated its full meaning immediately. He said, "Walk me through it." Calloway walked him through it in the methodical, sequential manner of a man who has decided that the most useful thing he can do with difficult information is to present it in the order that allows its implications to be grasped fully before them. Response begins. The compound in Adhamiyah that DEVGRU intended to enter in 4 hours was simultaneously an active British surveillance objective. Task Force Black had been watching it for 21 days from a position that provided direct sight lines on the compound's primary approach routes, the routes that the DEVGRU assault element would be using in 4 hours. The British operators in that position had been there for 11 hours. They would still be there when the DEVGRU breach element came through the compound gate, moving at speed, in darkness, in the configuration of a direct action assault. The British operators did not know the DEVGRU breach element was coming. This was the sentence that carried the full weight of what was about to happen. two Allied Special Operations units, operating in the same city under the same coalition command, had arrived at the same objective on the same night from opposite directions with incompatible activities. And the coordination process that was supposed to prevent this had failed to prevent it because the process was designed to deconflict planned operations, and neither side understood that the other had a stake in the specific location that was now 4 hours from the breach window, the subject of two simultaneous activities that could not both proceed as planned. The specific danger was not abstract. It was geometric and it was immediate. The SAS observation position provided sight lines on the compound's primary approach routes. A DEVGRU assault element moving toward the compound at speed, in darkness, in the configuration of a direct action team, indistinguishable from a distance and at night. From the hostile actors, that observation position had been established precisely to watch for, would present to SAS operators under hostile territory rules of engagement as an unidentified approaching force. The rules of engagement that governed forward observation operators in that threat environment permitted engagement of approaching forces that could not be positively identified as friendly. The distance, the darkness, the speed of a DEVGRU approach, and the visual profile of an assault element in full kit and night vision would not, in those conditions, provide the time necessary for positive identification through any method the British operators had available. The timeline from first visual contact to the decision point, based on the planned approach geometry, was somewhere between 4 and 8 seconds. Positive identification of Allied forces at that distance in those conditions required more than 4 to 8 seconds. Reyes understood this before Calloway finished the sentence. He had been in enough places where the geometry of a mission converged with the geometry of a parallel activity to recognize immediately what this convergence produced. The convergence was not a planning failure or a coordination gap in any ordinary sense. It was the collision of two correct decisions: the British decision to establish a surveillance position covering the compound's approaches, and the DEVGRU decision to approach via the routes the intelligence had assessed as optimal, that had arrived at the same point from opposite directions, and that had produced, in their convergence, a situation that neither decision individually had created, and neither could individually resolve. He called Hartley. The call lasted 4 minutes. Reyes spoke for less than 90 seconds of those 4 minutes, the time required to present the situation accurately. Hartley asked 3 clarifying questions in less than a minute. The remaining time was Hartley processing what he had been told. Reyes had been in enough calls with enough commanders under pressure to know that the silence was not absence of thought, but its presence, the specific cognitive work of a man who has received information that significantly alters the problem he was planning for, and is now recalibrating every prior decision against the new information. "Get Calloway," Hartley said. "I need the British commander on a line in the next 10 minutes to understand what Hartley was facing. It is necessary to understand what October 2004 meant for the JSOC targeting operation in Baghdad, beyond a single compound and a single target. The JSOC operation was under pressure that month of a kind, combining operational, political, and institutional dimensions in ways that the operational picture alone did not fully capture. The operational pressure came from the network assessments. The picture that said the Baghdad insurgency was expanding its reach and sophistication at a rate the current targeting tempo was not keeping pace with. That nodes being removed were being replaced faster than the targeting process was removing them, and that the only way to change this dynamic was to increase tempo and precision. The political pressure came from Washington and from the coalition command headquarters. where General Casey was managing expectations about the trajectory of the Iraq campaign that the ground reality was consistently failing to meet. The institutional pressure came from within JSOC itself, from the command architecture McChrystal was building, which required each element to justify its operational value through results in ways that created, at the element level, an incentive structure that weighted action against hesitation. Into this environment, the Falcon operation was the third attempt at a target that experienced analysts had assessed as operationally significant. The first two windows had closed before action was possible. The assessment that a third failed window would preclude a fourth was the basis on which Hartley had planned. Losing the window now meant losing Falcon. And losing Falcon meant accepting that 6 weeks of intelligence development had produced nothing against a target the targeting process had invested in 3 times. This was the weight on one side of Hartley's calculation, as Calloway established the coordination channel to the task force black commanding officer. Real weight. Weight that his institutional responsibilities required him to feel. On the other side was the weight of a possible outcome that the morning's report would describe as a friendly fire incident between two of the closest allies in the Western military world, an outcome that would require casualty notifications, investigations at the tactical and political level simultaneously, and damage to the alliance that the loss of a single intelligence window could not remotely approach. The task force black commanding officer came on the coordination channel at 22:03 hours, 9 minutes after Hartley's request. The brevity of 9 minutes was itself meaningful. It indicated that the British command had been monitoring the developing situation through Calloway's updates and was prepared. The officer was a lieutenant colonel, 15 years in the SAS. Troop-level command in Northern Ireland during the period when the regiment was running its most complex undercover intelligence operations. Squadron-level command in Afghanistan before Baghdad. His voice on the coordination channel had the quality of a man who had been in enough situations where voices transmitted urgency and created problems to have learned to keep his voice from doing either. "Tell me the approach route," he said. No preamble, Hartley told him. The silence that followed lasted 14 seconds. Rays counted them. Not because he was keeping time, but because the silence was the kind that becomes countable, where each second accumulates weight rather than simply passes. It was not the silence of a man who didn't know what to do. It was the silence of a man calculating whether what he was considering was possible, working through the geometry of positions and distances and timelines, and terrain with a specific precision. That people who have done this kind of work for long enough bring to this kind of calculation under time pressure. 14 seconds in which the shape of the entire night was being determined by a British lieutenant colonel on a radio channel in a Baghdad compound, working out whether the answer to a question that had not yet been formally asked was yes or no. "I can withdraw the observation element," the Black Six said. "It will take 22 minutes. I need the launch window held until I confirm complete." The condition he attached was specific, and its specificity was itself meaningful, the product of the same 14-second calculation that had produced the answer. The withdrawal would require movement through a section of ground that fell within the planned outer cordon geometry of the DEVGRU operation. Not the assault element's movement corridor, but the broader security perimeter that the operation's outer element would be establishing. British operators moving out of the observation position would be moving through ground that DEVGRU personnel were going to be in darkness, without the American outer cordon having been briefed on the presence of British operators in that ground. A secondary deconfliction problem nested inside the primary one, identified and articulated in the same breath that articulated the solution to the primary. He resolved it immediately. Task Force Black would transmit the route and timing of the withdrawal to the DEVGRU Operations Center in real time, updated every 90 seconds. The DEVGRU Outer Cordon would receive a briefing on British movement in their area of responsibility before emplacement. The coordination channel would remain open for the full duration of the withdrawal. If Falcon moved at any point during the 22 minutes, if the withdrawal produced noise or light or any indication that reached the compound and caused a reaction, the Black 6 would transmit immediately, and Hartley would make the call on whether to accelerate. Hartley agreed. He put down the handset and looked at the operations center around him. The screens, the personnel, the machinery of a targeting system that was, at this moment, paused, waiting. The pause was not a failure. It was the specific achievement of two commanding officers who had understood the situation correctly and made the decisions the situation required. Under time pressure and incomplete information, and in the face of institutional pressures pointing in different directions from the ones their judgment was directing them toward. The pause was what professional coalition warfare looked like when it was working. What happened in the next 22 minutes was the kind of operation that does not appear in any public account of the Baghdad campaign, and that the men who conducted it remember with the specific clarity of events that were deeply high stakes, without being dramatic in the way that dramatic events are usually described. No weapons fired, no buildings breached, no noise beyond what could not be avoided. 5 SAS operators moving out of a position they had held for 11 hours, through the specific nightscape of Adhamiyah at 2210 hours, generators running their background frequency. The occasional vehicle on the main road 100 meters north, the ambient life of a city that had learned to continue in different forms at different hours. The operators moved in the pattern designed to minimize visible signature, separated by intervals that prevented visual clustering, using slightly different routes that converged at the secondary observation position, without losing the coordination that the route's tactical requirements demanded. The movement was tracked from both ends simultaneously. The Task Force Black Operations Center monitored the operators' positions through their personal location devices and transmitted updates to the DEVGRU Operations Center on the schedule the Black 6 had specified. Callaway managed the American side of the coordination channel, translating the British updates into the operational language the DEVGRU element needed, maintaining the specific quality of comm in his transmissions that coordination channels require in moments when comm is not the natural condition of the people communicating. He had been the liaison for 6 weeks. He had been building toward this kind of moment for 6 weeks, accumulating the professional credit that liaison officers accumulate through small competencies and that they spend in large moments. At 22:31 hours, the Black 6 transmitted, element moving, route clear, no anomalies, compound activity nominal. In the DEVGRU Operations Center, the transmission landed with the specific weight of a clock update that tells you time is passing correctly. Reyes was at the coordination monitor, tracking each transmission as it came in, understanding in a way he would later write about that the information was not primarily about the British operators' positions. It was about the gap between now and the launch window. Each transmission, a confirmation that the gap was closing, without the situation deteriorating. At 22:39 hours, element at midpoint, route clear, compound activity nominal, no rear access movement observed. The rear access information was the detail that mattered most at that stage. If Falcon was going to move during the withdrawal, the rear access of the compound was where he would move. The British secondary position, established as part of the withdrawal condition, was providing the coverage that the primary position, now being vacated, had previously provided. The coverage was not identical. Angles were different, the sight lines were different. And the 11 hours of operational familiarity with the compounds, patterns that the primary position had accumulated, could not be transferred to the secondary position in the minutes available. But it was sufficient. Falcon was not moving. At 22:44 hours, element approaching secondary position, route clear, compound activity nominal. Reyes became conscious, in those final minutes, of the specific quality of the operations center around him. The way that rooms containing people under that kind of pressure have a particular ambient tension that is neither panic nor calm, but the sustained professional alertness that experienced operators maintain when the situation is still developing and could develop in more than one direction. No one spoke unnecessarily. The communications specialist at the coordination monitor logged each transmission without commentary. Hartley stood at the mission display with the posture of a man who has made his decisions and is now waiting for the situation to confirm or contradict them. At 22:47 hours, on a coordination channel that had been silent for 8 minutes, the silence of an operations center that knows better than to interrupt a movement proceeding correctly, the Black Six transmitted. His voice had the same quality it had carried throughout the preceding 37 minutes, which was the quality of a man who had been carrying a significant weight and was now setting it down in a controlled manner rather than dropping it. Withdrawal complete. All personnel clear of DEVGRU approach routes. Compound rear access under observation from secondary position. No movement observed at primary or rear access points. A pause. Falcon is still in the building. In the DEVGRU Operations Center, the silence that followed this transmission was different from the silence of the preceding 8 minutes. It was the silence of a room that has been holding something and has just been permitted to release it. Reyes felt the release without naming it, felt the specific physical change of attention maintained at a level, requiring sustained effort, simply ceasing to require that effort, replaced by the different tension of action, which professional soldiers generally find more manageable than waiting. Hartley launched the mission at 22:51 hours. The 400 meters between the vehicle drop point and the compound wall took the assault element 11 minutes to cover. The movement was not fast in the way the word assault suggests, not the speed of noise and announced intent. It was fast in the way that professional soldiers move through hostile territory, when a mission requires them to be somewhere at a specific time, without advertising their approach, controlled, deliberate, using the spatial awareness and situational processing that training builds and operational experience refines into something that is no longer trained response, but instinct. They moved through Adhamiyah at 22:51 hours, past generators running their background frequency, past the specific ambient life of a neighborhood that had learned to compress its visible activity into daylight hours and continue in different form after dark. The compound wall was 3 meters high, concrete block over rubble core, visible from 80 meters through night vision as a darker density against the dark of the neighborhood. Not an obstacle, but a problem to be solved. The breach element went over at 22:58 hours. 2 operators on the north face, 2 on the east, separated by 45 seconds so that the primary breach element was already moving toward the building by the time the secondary element cleared the wall. The timing reflected operational learning accumulated across the deployment. The window between the first sound of breach activity and the reaction from inside had been consistently shorter than pre-mission estimates, and the adaptation had been to compress the time between breach and entry. The interior of the main building had the quality that occupied buildings have at that hour: a single lamp in the central corridor. Rooms differentiated by the presence or absence of light beneath their closed doors. The breach element moved through the corridor with the physical economy of people for whom this movement is not performance but procedure. Falcon was in the third room on the right. He was at a table. Papers, a phone, a lamp casting the kind of light that makes a room feel smaller than it is. He was 44 years old. 18 years in the Iraqi intelligence service before the regime's fall, and the habits of that career, the late nights, the careful management of communications, the professional attention to who knew what and when, had not changed because the organization he had served had ceased to exist. He had redirected those habits toward the network that had replaced it in his operational life. He was awake because men in his position are often awake at this hour. Because the work of moving money and people across borders and through cities does not respect civilian schedules. He looked at the breach element when they came through the door. The quality of that look, assessed afterward by the operator who had been first through the door, was the quality of someone who was not surprised. Not who had been expecting this specific moment, but who had, at some point in the preceding weeks, calculated this as a possible shape of an evening, and had arrived at whatever internal accommodation a man in his position arrives at when the calculation becomes reality. He did not reach for anything. He did not speak. His hands remained on the table. He was detained within 40 seconds. His phone was secured. His papers were secured. The room was photographed in the systematic way that exploitation requires. The full exploitation of the building, every document, every device, every piece of physical media that might carry intelligence value, took 27 minutes. During those 27 minutes, the outer cordon held the compound perimeter, and the SAS secondary position held the rear access, and the coordination channel between the two task forces remained open, transmitting nothing because there was nothing that required transmission. The operation was proceeding as planned. 3 additional individuals in the secondary structure were detained, and the structure was cleared in 12 minutes. The element was back over the wall and into the vehicles at 23:41 hours. No shots fired, no coalition casualties, no civilian casualties. The SAS secondary observation position confirmed no movement at the compound's rear access during the full operation. The exfiltration to the staging base was clean. By every measure that tactical execution is measured against, the operation was a success. Falcon captured, exploitation product secured, force extracted without incident. What those measures did not capture, what they were not designed to capture, was the 37 minutes between Calloway's appearance at the targeting cell door and Hartley's launch of the mission. The decision chain that had moved through Rays to Hartley to the coordination channel to the Black Six and back, the 14 seconds, the 22 minutes of withdrawal. The coordination channel receiving British position updates every 90 seconds into an operations center that was holding its launch window open, while 2 Allied units conducted a precise, unannounced, unrehearsed close-quarters deconfliction operation through the streets of Adhamiyah. The Falcon exploitation product, processed in the days and weeks that followed, was assessed as significant. The materials recovered from the compound, documents, devices, and a notebook whose contents the analysts who processed it would assess as the most significant single document taken from the Ba'athist facilitation network in Baghdad in the preceding 6 months, contained 17 separate facilitation routes between the Syrian border and Baghdad that had not previously appeared in the collection picture, financing channels with account designations and correspondent bank details that the financial intelligence community could act on, and personnel identifiers of network individuals whose existence had not previously been confirmed. The assessment of the notebook's intelligence contribution was that it had advanced the Baghdad Ba'athist network picture by a period equivalent to 3 to 4 months of collection under the existing architecture. 2 operations in the 4 weeks following the mission drew directly on the Falcon exploitation product and produced captures the targeting process assessed as meaningful. A 3rd operation in the 6th week produced what the intelligence assessment described as the most significant single capture in the Baghdad Ba'athist network targeting in the preceding 6 months. The causal chain from the compound in Adhamiyah to that 3rd operation was not direct. It ran through several degrees of analytical processing and additional collection that the Falcon product had enabled, but it was traceable, and the intelligence officers who traced it were confident in the tracing. The case that the DEVGRU operation had been worth running was, by any honest assessment, strong. The case that it had come within a specific arrangement of positions, an approach, routes and rules of engagement, and darkness of not running at all, of producing an outcome that would have appeared not in the targeting log but in the casualty notification system, was equally strong and considerably less comfortable to make. The after-action review was convened 48 hours after the operation. Both commanding officers attended. The JSOC senior representative and the British senior representative in Baghdad were present. It was, by the accounts of those present, a professional and honest examination of what had occurred. It produced a primary recommendation, an enhanced deconfliction requirement mandating both task forces to disclose active surveillance positions in any geographic area where a planned direct action operation was proposed, regardless of whether those positions were associated with a planned operation of their own. This was a genuine improvement. It addressed the specific procedural gap, surveillance position non-disclosure, that had allowed 2 units to arrive at the same objective with incompatible activities and without either knowing about the other's stake in the location. The recommendation was implemented. Both task forces incorporated it into their deconfliction processes. It was subsequently included in the broader coalition Special Operations Coordination Framework, developed between 2004 and 2006. As the JSOC architecture in Iraq matured and the procedures for managing coalition friction within it were progressively refined. The Chilcot Inquiry, published in 2016, found in its examination of British decision-making in the Iraq War that intelligence coordination between British and American forces was characterized by systematic incompleteness, each nation protecting sources and methods from the other with the same institutional instinct used to protect them from adversaries, and that coordination improvements implemented in 2004 and 2005 represented genuine progress toward addressing that incompleteness without resolving the structural incentives that produced it. The structural incentives were not procedural. They were institutional, built into the cultures of organizations formed in different historical contexts, developed through different operational experiences, optimized for different approaches to the fundamental problem of what special operations forces were for. The SAS optimization was for intelligence development and network understanding. The DEVGRU optimization was for direct action at speed. Both were correct within their respective institutional frameworks. Both produced results that the other approach could not achieve alone. Both also produced, when operating simultaneously in the same geographic area, a level of coordination friction that the existing procedures had not been built to manage, friction that the men on the ground had to manage instead. Through the combination of professional judgment, established relationships, and the institutional trust that develops between allied forces who have been doing difficult things together long enough to know each other's operational language. Reyes filed his after-action contribution 3 weeks after the operation. He worked through the standard framework and found, as he consistently found with operations whose implications exceeded their tactical dimensions, that the framework was most useful as a starting point, and that the things most necessary to record were the things that did not fit naturally inside it. He wrote about the tactical execution honestly, including the dimension that the tactical execution report could not fully hold, the specific quality of the 22 minutes between the Black Six's agreement to withdraw and his confirmation that the withdrawal was complete. He had been monitoring the coordination channel for those 22 minutes, tracking position updates as they arrived. And he had understood in a way that the subsequent clean outcome made easy to set aside that those 22 minutes had contained within them a genuine branching point. Not a probable catastrophe, not even a likely one. A possible one, dependent on the continued correctness of specific decisions by specific individuals in specific positions, any one of which going differently would have changed the night entirely. He wrote about the near miss in terms that were accurate and that he knew would make institutional readers uncomfortable. The comfortable version of the story, in which the coordination worked, the operation succeeded, and the after-action produced improvements addressing the gap, was true in all its specifics and false in its implication, which was that the system had worked. The system had not worked. The system had been caught by the humans inside it, Calloway at a workstation in the targeting cell rather than the liaison office, Hartley going directly to the British commanding officer rather than routing through liaison channels, the Black Six making a command decision in real time that accepted operational risk to his own observation element in order to clear the American approach. Any of those 3 human decisions going differently, and the 22-minute window does not exist. He wrote that he did not know how to systematize that. He thought the honest institutional conclusion was that coalition special operations in complex environments would continue producing situations where the safety margin was narrower than the system was designed to maintain, and that managing those situations would continue depending, in part, on the quality and positioning of specific individuals. Acknowledging this was more useful than pretending that procedural improvements had resolved a problem whose roots ran deeper than procedure. The Black Six wrote his own report in a parallel institutional space that Reyes never saw. The 2 reports referenced the same events through analytical frameworks that shared premises at the level of general principle and diverged at the level of operational priority, exactly where it mattered, and exactly what the after-action review's joint lessons learned process was designed to bridge. The bridging was partial. Some lessons translated across the institutional boundary. Some did not, and the ones that did not were generally the ones most deeply embedded in the institutional cultures the boundary separated. The alliance continued. The operations continued. The coordination improved in the specific ways that the after-action recommendations addressed and retained the structural tensions the recommendations could not address, because those tensions were not failures of procedure, but expressions of institutional identity that predated the Iraq War and would outlast it. In most operations, the tensions were managed well enough that they did not produce a near miss. In some operations, they produced friction of a different kind. This was the normal condition of coalition warfare, not the press conference version, where allied forces stand shoulder to shoulder and speak of shared values and shared mission, but the operational version, where 2 organizations with different institutional cultures run missions in overlapping geographic areas under time pressure and incomplete information. managing the resulting friction through the combination of professional training, individual judgment, and the accumulated trust that distinguishes organizations that have been doing difficult things together for a long time. The SAS and DEVGRU had been doing difficult things together for a long time by October 2004. That history was what made the 22 minutes possible. It was what allowed two commanding officers who had never met in person to arrive, on a radio call, at a decision that accepted operational risk in order to prevent a worse outcome, without the institutional friction that less established relationships produce, and that would have consumed the time. The situation did not have. This is what the special relationship looks like in the operational spaces that are not visible in the official record. Not the declarations and the bilateral frameworks and the shared targeting lists. The 22 minutes. The radio call between two commanding officers who needed to trust each other immediately, and did. The individual judgment of a liaison officer who understood that the moment required him to raise an alarm rather than process a notification. The collective decision to accept a short-term operational complication in order to preserve something that mattered more than the convenience of the planned timetable. The alliance held that night because the people inside it were good enough and experienced enough and trusted each other enough to hold it. That is not a comfortable institutional conclusion, because it is not an institutional conclusion at all. It is a human one. The institution provided the training, the relationship, and the protocols that made the humans' decisions possible. The humans made the decisions. The 22 minutes do not appear in any public account of the Baghdad campaign. They exist in the operational memory of the people who lived them, the specific weight of a window that was barely wide enough, the specific texture of a calculation made under time pressure by a commanding officer who had spent 15 years building toward the judgment that 14 seconds required, the specific quality of a coordination channel receiving position updates every 90 seconds into an operations center, holding its breath in the way operations centers hold their breath when what is happening is the only thing they can do about what could happen. The people who carry those 22 minutes carry them in the specific way that professional soldiers carry the moments that almost went wrong. Not heavily, not with drama. Because drama is the enemy of the professional equanimity that allows them to continue functioning after the moments that almost went wrong, and the moments that do go wrong, and all the moments between. They carry it as knowledge, as the specific kind of knowledge that changes how you read coordination processes and deconfliction protocols, and the institutional frameworks that are supposed to prevent the 22-minute situations from developing, frameworks that you understand, once you have lived inside one, as necessary and insufficient simultaneously. The difference in Baghdad in October 2004 between what happened and what almost happened was 22 minutes. And before those 22 minutes, it was 14 seconds. And before those 14 seconds, it was a Royal Navy lieutenant walking across a targeting cell with a specific expression on his face. The alliance held because of all three, which is, in the operational reality of coalition warfare, both everything and not enough. Both, always both.